Karen had dreamed of this moment for as long as she could remember. Growing up in a small, quiet town where nothing exciting ever happened, her imagination often wandered to faraway places filled with history, culture, and grandeur. London was always at the top of her list. She'd spent countless hours watching documentaries about Buckingham Palace, reading books on British royalty, and even practicing her best royal wave in front of the mirror. Finally, after years of saving every penny from her job at the local bakery, Karen found herself standing outside one of the most iconic landmarks in the world. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves mixed with the distant hum of traffic. Tourists bustled around her, cameras clicking and phones held high as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the palace gates. Karen felt a thrill run through her body. This wasn't just any vacation, it was her adventure. She adjusted the strap of her purse, making sure her pepper spray was still tucked safely inside. It was a habit she'd picked up back home, where safety always came first. Little did she know how much trouble that tiny canister would cause later. As she stood there, gazing at the towering gold-trimmed gates of Buckingham Palace, Karen couldn't help but marvel at the sight before her. The guards stationed outside were like statues carved out of human flesh, tall, stoic, and dressed in their striking red tunics and bearskin hats. They stood perfectly still, their faces expressionless, exuding an aura of authority that seemed almost otherworldly. Karen tilted her head slightly, studying them closely. Were they really not allowed to move? Could they blink? She wondered if anyone had ever managed to make them crack a smile or react to something funny. Her curiosity grew as she noticed other tourists testing the boundaries. Some waved wildly, trying to catch the guards' attention. Others posed for silly photos, pretending to poke the guards or whisper secrets into their ears. A group of teenagers nearby giggled uncontrollably when one of them made a goofy face, only to be met with zero reaction from the guard. Karen chuckled softly, shaking her head. While she didn't plan to join in on the antics, she couldn't deny being intrigued by the spectacle unfolding around her. She took a step closer to the barrier, her eyes fixed on one particular guard who seemed to tower over the rest. His posture was impeccable, his rifle resting neatly against his shoulder. For a brief moment, Karen imagined what it must feel like to stand there all day, completely disconnected from the lively crowd surrounding you. Did he get bored? Frustrated? Or was it just another day at work for him? Just then, the guard shifted ever so slightly, turning his head toward her. Karen's breath caught in her throat. Was he looking at her? She froze, unsure of what to do next. Her mind raced with questions. Was it okay to approach him? Should she smile? Wave? Or was she supposed to stay put and admire from afar? Before she could decide, someone behind her tapped her shoulder, pulling her attention away. Little did Karen know, this simple distraction would set off a chain of events that would change her trip and her life forever. But for now, she remained blissfully unaware, soaking in the magic of the moment, and feeling grateful to be exactly where she had always wanted to be. Karen had always considered herself a rule follower. Back in her small town, she was the type of person who read instructions carefully before assembling furniture or double-checked parking signs to avoid fines. But as she stood near the gates of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by a sea of tourists, something about the atmosphere made her feel less cautious and more curious. The energy was infectious. People laughed, pointed, and snapped photos without a care in the world. It seemed like everyone was having fun, pushing boundaries just a little bit to see what they could get away with. The guards, of course, were the main attraction. Their unwavering stillness fascinated Karen. She watched closely as tourists tried everything they could think of to provoke even the slightest reaction. One man pretended to trip and fall dramatically in front of a guard, only to be ignored completely. A child waved a stuffed animal in the guard's face, giggling when there was no response. Even some adults joined in on the antics, striking silly poses or whispering exaggerated secrets into the guard's ears. Karen shook her head, amused but also slightly uncomfortable. They're not supposed to react. She muttered under her breath, recalling snippets of information she'd read online about royal protocol. Still, part of her wondered if maybe the rules weren't as strict as they seemed. After all, these guards were human beings too, right? Maybe they secretly enjoyed the playful banter, or at least tolerated it, because it came with the job. Her thoughts drifted back to the guard standing closest to her. He looked impossibly tall, his uniform crisp and immaculate. His rifle rested against his shoulder, gleaming faintly in the morning light. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, Karen felt drawn to him. She took another small step closer, leaning slightly forward, as if trying to understand the mystery behind his stoic expression. Was he bored, annoyed, or simply focused on doing his duty? Just then, the guard turned his head ever so slightly, his eyes scanning the crowd. Karen's heart skipped a beat. Was he looking at her? She froze, unsure of how to interpret the movement. Did it mean he wanted her to come closer? Or was he merely checking for potential threats, as part of his training? Her mind raced with possibilities. She glanced around nervously, wondering if anyone else noticed the subtle shift in his posture. Before she could make sense of the situation, someone tapped her gently on the shoulder. Startled, Karen whipped around to see a young woman pointing excitedly toward a nearby street performer dressed as a jester. The colorful figure was juggling flaming torches while balancing on stilts, drawing cheers from the gathered crowd. Karen smiled politely, nodding to show she understood. But by the time she turned back to face the guard, her nerves were already frayed. In that moment of confusion, Karen's instincts began to override her rational thinking. The tap on her shoulder had startled her more than she cared to admit, and now her mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. What if someone was coming up behind her? What if they intended to grab her bag or push past her in the crowded space? Her fingers instinctively tightened around the strap of her purse, rushing against the hard cylinder inside. She hadn't planned to use the pepper spray during her trip. It was just a precautionary measure, something she carried out of habit. But suddenly, it felt like her only line of defense. Karen hesitated, glancing between the guard and the bustling crowd around her. Everything seemed chaotic yet harmless at the same time. Yet, her pulse quickened as doubt crept in. Was she overreacting? Probably. But what if she wasn't? As she wrestled with her thoughts, she failed to notice the warning signs posted near the barriers, reminding visitors to keep their distance and respect the guard's space. In her heightened state of anxiety, those details slipped entirely from her mind. What happened next would unfold in a blur, a split-second decision driven by fear rather than logic. Karen's grip tightened on her purse, her hand closing around the familiar shape of the pepper spray canister. She didn't fully realize what she was about to do until it was too late. And as the chaos erupted around her, she would quickly learn that her actions carried consequences far greater than she could have imagined. Karen's heart was pounding so loudly, she could hear it in her ears. The tap on her shoulder had thrown her off completely, and now her mind was racing faster than she could process. She turned back toward the guard, her thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. Her eyes darted around the crowd, searching for any sign of danger. Was someone coming up behind her? Was there a reason she should feel threatened? She couldn't tell. All she knew was that her body had gone into full alert mode. Her fingers fumbled inside her purse, brushing against keys, a crumpled tissue, and finally, the cold metal canister she brought along just in case. Karen didn't even pause to think about what she was doing. To her, the world had narrowed down to one thing: protecting herself. In that split second, the guard standing before her wasn't a ceremonial figure representing centuries of tradition. He was a looming presence, too close for comfort. Her grip tightened around the pepper spray as adrenaline surged through her veins. Before she could second-guess herself, Karen raised her arm and pressed down on the nozzle. A fine mist shot out, catching the guard square in the face. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. The guard, who had been standing perfectly still just seconds earlier, suddenly flinched. His hands flew to his eyes, and he let out a sharp cough. Karen watched in stunned silence as the once stoic figure staggered slightly, breaking his rigid stance for the first time. The sound of his cough cut through the air like a knife, snapping Karen out of her trance. At first, she felt a strange mix of relief and triumph. She'd acted quickly, just like she'd always been taught to do in emergencies. But then reality began to sink in. The guard wasn't reacting the way an attacker would. He wasn't shouting or lunging at her. Instead, he was struggling to breathe, his movements frantic but controlled. Other guards nearby immediately sprang into action, rushing to his side while barking orders to clear the area. Panic spread through the crowd like wildfire. Tourists screamed and scrambled backward, unsure of what was happening. Some shielded their faces, thinking the pepper spray might reach them too. Others whipped out their phones, filming the scene as if it were some bizarre spectacle. Karen stood frozen, her arms still extended, the canister dangling limply from her fingers. Her mind raced to piece together what she had just done. Why hadn't the guard moved when she sprayed him? Why weren't the others helping him fight back? It was only when the guard doubled over, coughing violently, that the truth hit her like a ton of bricks. These men weren't ordinary security personnel. They were royal guards, trained to maintain composure no matter what happened. They weren't allowed to retaliate, even if provoked. And Karen, in her moment of panic, had crossed a line she didn't fully understand. Her stomach churned as guilt washed over her. She stared at the guard, watching as his colleagues helped him step away from the gate. His pristine red uniform, once a symbol of pride and discipline, now looked disheveled. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to recover, his breathing labored. Karen's vision blurred with tears of her own. She wanted to shout an apology, to run forward and explain that it had all been a terrible mistake. But the words caught in her throat, drowned out by the rising chaos around her. Security officers appeared almost instantly, their voices sharp and commanding as they ordered people to move back. Karen lowered her arm slowly, her hand trembling as she slipped the pepper spray back into her purse. Her cheeks burned with shame as she realized the gravity of her actions. This wasn't just a harmless prank or a minor misunderstanding. It was a serious breach of protocol, one that could have real consequences. As the commotion continued, Karen found herself rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. She had come to London to experience history and culture, to marvel at the traditions that made this city so unique. Instead, she had become part of a story she never wanted to tell. A story of panic, poor judgment, and unintended harm. For the first time in her life, Karen truly understood the weight of her choices, and as the officers began ushering her away from the crowd, she knew her trip, and perhaps her entire perspective on life, would never be the same again. The moment the pepper spray hit the air, chaos erupted like a storm breaking loose. The guard's sharp cough echoed through the crowd, piercing the morning calm. What had been a scene of lighthearted curiosity, just moments ago turned into something far more serious. The once still figure in red now staggered slightly, his hands clutching at his face as he struggled to breathe. His stoic demeanor crumbled under the unexpected attack, and for the first time, Karen saw him not as an unmovable statue, but as a person, someone who was suffering because of her actions. Other guards nearby sprang into action with military precision. Two of them immediately stepped forward, guiding their affected comrade away from the gate, while shielding him from further exposure. Their movements were swift yet deliberate, a testament to their training. One guard held his arm around the man's shoulder, helping him steady himself, while another called out commands to clear the area. "Step back. Move away," they shouted, their voices firm and commanding. Tourists scrambled backward, some tripping over each other in their haste to distance themselves from the unfolding drama. Karen stood frozen, her legs rooted to the ground. Her heart pounded so hard, she thought it might burst out of her chest. She watched as the guard's colleagues led him toward a nearby bench, where he collapsed, still coughing violently. His face was red, tears streaming down his cheeks as he fought to regain control of his breathing. The pristine uniform that had once seemed so regal now looked disheveled, stained with the evidence of human vulnerability. It was a stark contrast to the image of perfection Karen had admired only moments earlier. Around her, panic spread like wildfire. Some tourists screamed, fearing the situation might escalate further. Others shielded their faces, worried the pepper spray might drift toward them on the breeze. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene as if it were some bizarre reality show. Flashing cameras and murmured gasps filled the air, adding to the surreal atmosphere. But Karen barely noticed any of it. Her focus remained fixed on the guard, guilt gnawing at her insides like a relentless beast. Security officers arrived almost instantly, their presence amplifying the tension. Clad in dark uniforms, they moved with authority, barking orders to restore order. Everyone step back. Do not interfere. One officer commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. He scanned the crowd, searching for the source of the disturbance. When his eyes landed on Karen, still standing motionless near the gate, holding her purse tightly, he strode toward her without hesitation. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," he said firmly, gesturing for her to follow. Karen nodded numbly, her mind racing but unable to form coherent thoughts. As she took a hesitant step forward, the weight of what she had done pressed down on her shoulders. The laughter and chatter of the crowd faded into the background, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though invisible weights were dragging her down. As she was escorted away from the scene, Karen stole one last glance at the guard. He was sitting upright now, though his breathing remained labored. Another officer handed him a bottle of water, which he used to rinse his eyes. Despite everything, he maintained a sense of dignity, refusing to let the incident completely break him. Karen noticed how his colleagues hovered protectively around him, ensuring he was okay. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the bond they shared, a bond she had unknowingly disrupted. By the time Karen disappeared behind the security barriers, the crowd had begun to settle. Whispers rippled through the group as people pieced together what had happened. Some expressed sympathy for the guard, while others criticized Karen's actions, shaking their heads in disbelief. For Karen, however, none of that mattered. All she could think about was the look of pain on the guard's face, the same face she had marveled at just minutes earlier. As she followed the officers toward the palace grounds, her mind replayed the events over and over again. How could she have misjudged the situation so badly? Why hadn't she stopped to consider the consequences before acting? These questions swirled in her head, leaving her feeling hollow and ashamed. The dream vacation she had envisioned, a chance to immerse herself in history and culture, had taken a dramatic turn, transforming into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And as the gates of Buckingham Palace loomed ahead, Karen knew she was about to face the full weight of her mistake. Karen sat in a small, dimly lit room inside the palace grounds, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The sterile walls and the faint hum of fluorescent lights above her did little to ease the storm raging inside her mind. Two security officers stood nearby, their expressions unreadable but undeniably stern. One of them held a notepad, jotting down notes as they questioned her about what had happened. Karen's voice trembled as she tried to explain herself, stumbling over her words like someone lost in a maze. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. I thought he was coming at me. I panicked." Her explanation sounded hollow even to her own ears. How could she possibly justify spraying a royal guard with pepper spray? It was an act born out of fear and confusion, but that didn't make it any less wrong. She glanced at the officers, searching for some sign of understanding or compassion, but their faces remained impassive. The gravity of her actions hit her harder with each passing moment. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a violation of protocol, an insult to centuries-old traditions. The guards outside weren't ordinary security personnel. They were symbols of the monarchy, trained to uphold dignity and discipline no matter the circumstances. And Karen, in her moment of panic, had treated one of them like a threat. The realization made her stomach churn. As the questioning continued, Karen learned more about the severity of her offense. The officer explained that assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard was considered a serious crime under British law. They took her passport details, warning her that legal consequences would likely follow. "This is not something we take lightly," the officer said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll need to cooperate fully moving forward." Karen nodded repeatedly, her throat too tight to speak. She felt like a child being scolded by a teacher, except this wasn't a classroom. It was Buckingham Palace, and the stakes were immeasurably higher. Every word the officers spoke seemed to weigh her down further, pressing on her chest until it became hard to breathe. She kept replaying the scene in her mind. The guard's startled reaction, the chaos that followed, the way his colleagues rushed to help him. It all felt surreal, like a movie she couldn't turn off. But amidst the guilt and fear, a flicker of determination began to grow within her. Karen knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could make things right. As the officers wrapped up their initial questioning, she gathered the courage to speak. "Can I apologize?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "To the guard, I mean. Can I tell him how sorry I am?" The officers exchanged glances, seemingly surprised by her request. After a brief pause, one of them replied, "We'll see. That depends on a lot of factors, including your cooperation and the guard's willingness to accept your apology." Those words gave Karen a tiny sliver of hope. She clung to them like a lifeline, vowing to do whatever it took to make amends. When the officers finally allowed her to leave, instructing her to remain in London pending further investigation, Karen stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. The streets were bustling with life, tourists laughing and chatting as if nothing unusual had occurred. To everyone else, it was just another day in the city. But for Karen, the world felt different now, heavier, more complicated. Back at her hotel, Karen stared at the blank page of her notebook, determined to write a heartfelt letter of apology. She wanted to explain her side of the story, not as an excuse, but as a way to show she understood the magnitude of her mistake. Her pen hovered over the paper as she struggled to find the right words. Finally, she began to write. Dear Sir, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for my actions today. I never intended to cause harm or disrespect to you or your role. What I did was reckless and thoughtless, and I will carry the weight of it for the rest of my life. Please know that I admire the work you do and the tradition you represent. If there is any way I can make this right, I am willing to do so. By the time she finished writing, tears had smudged some of the ink, but the sincerity behind her words was undeniable. She sealed the letter in an envelope and sent it to the palace authorities, hoping it might reach the guard who had been affected. Days passed before she received a response, inviting her back for a private meeting where she could personally apologize. When the invitation arrived, Karen's heart raced with a mix of anxiety and relief. This was her chance to face the situation head-on, to look the guard in the eye and convey her remorse directly. Though nervous, she accepted without hesitation. She knew it wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a step toward redemption, a way to prove that she was truly sorry. As she prepared for the meeting, Karen reflected on everything she had learned since arriving in London. This trip, which had started as a dream come true, had turned into a lesson she would never forget. She realized now that respect wasn't just about admiring grand traditions from afar. It was about understanding boundaries, showing empathy, and taking responsibility for one's actions. And as daunting as the road ahead seemed, Karen was ready to walk it, one careful step at a time. The day of the meeting arrived, and Karen felt a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. She had spent hours preparing, not just what she would say, but how she would carry herself. This wasn't just any apology. It was an opportunity to show genuine remorse and take full responsibility for her actions. As she stood outside the designated room within the palace grounds, her hands trembled slightly, clutching the envelope containing her handwritten letter. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears, each beat reminding her of the gravity of the moment. Finally, one of the palace staff members opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Karen stepped inside, her eyes scanning the modest yet dignified space. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of royal ceremonies and guards standing proudly in their uniforms. In the center of the room sat a small table with 2 chairs, one occupied by the guard she had pepper-sprayed, and the other left empty for her. He looked different now, no longer wearing his ceremonial red tunic, but instead dressed in a simple uniform shirt. His face was calm, though traces of discomfort lingered in his tired eyes. Karen hesitated for a moment before approaching the table. "Thank you for seeing me," she began softly, her voice trembling as she pulled out the chair across from him. I wanted to apologize in person." She placed the envelope on the table between them, sliding it gently toward him. "This is a letter I wrote to explain how sorry I am. But I know words on paper aren't enough." The guard glanced at the envelope briefly before looking up at her. His expression was unreadable, neither angry nor forgiving, just neutral. For a few seconds, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unsure if he would respond or even acknowledge her presence. She braced herself for rejection, fearing that her apology might be too little, too late. After what felt like an eternity, the guard finally spoke. His voice was steady but quiet, carrying a weight that made every word resonate deeply. "It's not easy being in my position," he said, his tone measured and professional. "We're trained to remain composed, no matter what happens, but when something unexpected occurs, something like this, it affects us more than people realize." Karen nodded vigorously, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand now," she replied, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I swear. I acted out of fear, without thinking about the consequences, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The guard studied her for a moment, his gaze softening ever so slightly. "Fear can make anyone do things they wouldn't normally do," he admitted. "But it's important to learn from those moments, to grow from them." His words struck Karen like a gentle yet firm reminder. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about understanding why it had happened and ensuring it never did again. Encouraged by his willingness to engage, Karen continued, "I came here today because I want to make things right," she said earnestly. "If there's anything I can do, anything at all, I'm willing to do it. Whether it's community service, paying for medical expenses, or simply learning more about your role and the rules surrounding it, I'll do whatever it takes." The guard nodded slowly, seemingly appreciative of her sincerity. "Your apology means a lot," he said after a pause. "Not many people take responsibility the way you have. That says something about your character." Though his tone remained formal, there was a hint of warmth in his words, a flicker of forgiveness that gave Karen a glimmer of hope. As the meeting drew to a close, Karen rose from her seat, bowing her head respectfully. "Thank you for listening," she said softly. "And thank you for accepting my apology. I promise I'll use this experience to become a better person." The guard stood as well, offering her a slight nod in return. It wasn't a hug or a handshake. It was a gesture of mutual respect, signaling the beginning of closure for both parties. Walking out of the room, Karen felt a mix of relief and humility wash over her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be legal repercussions to face. But this meeting had given her a sense of redemption. More importantly, it had taught her the value of accountability and the power of sincere apologies. As she stepped back into the crisp London air, she resolved to carry these lessons with her forever, turning a painful mistake into a catalyst for growth. Karen left the palace grounds that day feeling lighter, though not entirely free of guilt. The guard's measured response and quiet acceptance of her apology had given her a sense of closure she hadn't expected. But she knew this wasn't the end of her journey. While the private meeting had been an important step toward redemption, there were still consequences to face and lessons to learn that would shape how she moved forward. Over the next few days, Karen found herself reflecting deeply on everything that had happened. She replayed the guard's words in her mind. Fear can make anyone do things they wouldn't normally do, but it's important to learn from those moments, to grow from them. His calm demeanor and professionalism had struck a chord with her, reminding her of the importance of self-awareness and accountability. For the first time in her life, Karen realized that mistakes weren't just about apologizing. They were opportunities to change, for the better. Determined to honor the guard's grace and understanding, Karen decided to take action beyond the apology. She reached out to local organizations in London that focused on educating tourists about cultural etiquette and respect for historical landmarks. To her surprise, one of them welcomed her offer to volunteer. Over the following weeks, Karen spent hours helping distribute informational brochures near Buckingham Palace and other iconic sites, sharing tips with visitors on how to appreciate these spaces responsibly. "I learned this the hard way," she'd say with a sheepish smile when people asked why she was so passionate about the cause. Her honesty often sparked curiosity, leading to meaningful conversations about boundaries, traditions, and mutual respect. Back home, Karen continued her efforts by turning her experience into a cautionary tale. She shared her story with friends, family, and coworkers, not to embarrass herself, but to highlight the importance of thinking before acting. At first, she worried people might judge her or laugh at her expense, but their reactions surprised her. Instead of ridicule, she received support and admiration for owning up to her mistake and using it as a learning opportunity. Some even confessed their own embarrassing moments, creating a sense of camaraderie and shared humanity. Karen also wrote a heartfelt blog post titled, "The Day I Pepper Sprayed a Royal Guard and What I Learned." In it, she detailed her trip to London, the panic that led to her poor decision, and the aftermath that followed. She emphasized the need for awareness and empathy, urging readers to consider the impact of their actions on others, especially in unfamiliar environments. The post quickly gained traction online, resonating with travelers who appreciated her vulnerability and honesty. Comments poured in from around the world, many thanking her for shedding light on the importance of respecting cultural norms and traditions. But perhaps the most impactful part of Karen's redemption came months later, when she received a letter from the palace authorities. Enclosed was a note from the guard himself, expressing gratitude for her efforts to make amends and contribute positively to the community. "Your actions since the incident have shown great character," he wrote. "While what happened was unfortunate, I believe you've grown from it. And that's what matters most." Reading his words brought tears to Karen's eyes. It was more than forgiveness. It was validation that her efforts had made a difference. As time passed, Karen began to see her trip to London not as a failure, but as a turning point in her life. The dream vacation she had envisioned had transformed into something far more meaningful, a lesson in humility, responsibility, and personal growth. She carried those lessons with her wherever she went, applying them to every aspect of her life, from her relationships to her career to her interactions with strangers. One evening, sitting on her porch back home, Karen flipped through the photos from her trip. Among the snapshots of Big Ben, the Tower of London, and bustling street markets, she paused at a picture of Buckingham Palace. The grand structure stood proudly against the sky, its golden gates gleaming in the sunlight. For a moment, she allowed herself to smile, not because she had achieved perfection, but because she had embraced imperfection and turned it into something worthwhile. Karen knew she would never forget the guard whose composure and dignity had inspired her to be better, and while she hoped to return to London someday, she vowed to approach the city and the world with newfound wisdom and respect. After all, sometimes the greatest adventures aren't about ticking items off a bucket list. They're about growing into the person you're meant to become. Karen's life had changed in ways she never could have predicted when she first set foot in London. What began as a dream vacation A chance to explore the history and grandeur of one of the world's most iconic cities had turned into a journey of self-discovery, accountability, and growth. The incident at Buckingham Palace had been embarrassing, yes, but it also became a defining moment that shaped her perspective on responsibility, respect, and resilience. Months after returning home, Karen found herself reflecting on how far she'd come since that fateful day. Her small-town bakery job no longer felt like just a routine. It had become a platform for sharing stories and lessons with anyone who walked through the door. Customers often noticed the framed photo of Buckingham Palace hanging behind the counter, sparking conversations about her trip. At first, Karen hesitated to share too much, worried people might judge her. But over time, she realized that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was strength. She told her story openly, turning what could have been a source of shame into a message of hope and transformation. Her newfound passion for education extended beyond casual chats at work. Inspired by her volunteer experience in London, Karen partnered with local schools and community centers to give presentations on cultural awareness and responsible travel. Armed with slideshows, anecdotes, and even a few lighthearted jokes about her own misstep, she captivated audiences of all ages. "You don't have to make the same mistakes I did to learn valuable lessons," she'd say with a warm smile. Sometimes, all it takes is paying attention to the rules, to the people around you, and to yourself. The ripple effects of her efforts surprised even her. One high school teacher reached out to thank Karen for inspiring her students to think critically about their roles as global citizens. A family planning their first international trip wrote to her, saying her advice had helped them prepare not just logistically, but emotionally. Even strangers online continued to engage with her blog post, sharing how her story encouraged them to reflect on their own actions and choices. Each message reinforced Karen's belief that every experience, even the painful ones, could lead to something meaningful if approached with the right mindset. Back in London, word of Karen's efforts reached the palace authorities, who expressed quiet appreciation for her dedication to making amends. Though formal charges were ultimately dropped due to her cooperation and sincere remorse, the guard involved remained an unexpected ally in her journey. Through occasional correspondence facilitated by the palace, he shared updates about his recovery and thanked her again for using the incident as a catalyst for positive change. Their exchanges, though brief, carried a mutual respect that transcended the awkwardness of their initial encounter. As years passed, Karen returned to London, not as a wide-eyed tourist, but as someone deeply connected to its culture and traditions. This time, she stood outside Buckingham Palace with a camera slung around her neck, snapping photos alongside fellow visitors. When she saw the guard standing tall and stoic, she smiled knowingly, recalling the lessons she'd learned about boundaries, discipline, and grace under pressure. Instead of feeling intimidated or curious, she admired them from afar, silently thanking them for the role they played in shaping her new outlook on life. Karen's story eventually became part of local lore back home, retold at gatherings and coffee shops with equal parts humor and admiration. Friends teased her good-naturedly about the pepper spray incident, but there was always an undertone of pride in their voices. They saw how she had transformed a mistake into a mission, proving that redemption wasn't just possible, it was powerful. Looking back, Karen knew she wouldn't trade the experience for anything. It had taught her that life rarely goes according to plan. And that's okay. Mistakes are inevitable, but they're also opportunities to grow, connect, and contribute. As she sipped her morning coffee one crisp autumn day, the same season she'd visited London all those years ago, she smiled to herself. The woman sitting on her porch, surrounded by gratitude and purpose, was someone she barely recognized from the nervous tourist who once stood frozen outside Buckingham Palace. And so, Karen's adventure didn't end with regret or embarrassment. It ended with wisdom, courage, and a renewed sense of wonder about the world. After all, sometimes the greatest journeys aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that find us when we least expect them.